Eleanor's hands trembled as she fastened the last button on her pale blue gown, her eyes catching sight of something on her husband's coat draped over the chair. A trace of perfume, sweet, floral, and completely foreign to their home. She froze, her fingers hovering over the fabric, her heart pounding faster than it should for something so small. She told herself it was nothing. A crowded office, an accidental brush against a colleague. But the smell lingered in her mind long after she looked away. Charles called from downstairs, his voice cheerful in a way that felt hollow to her ears now. "Eleanor, we'll be late for the Duke's garden party." She smoothed her dress, took one last look in the mirror, and told her reflection to breathe. Today was supposed to be beautiful. The biggest social event of the season, hosted at the grand estate of the Duke of Ashbourne, a place known for its rose gardens and its glittering fountains. Guests from every corner of the county would be there, dressed in their finest, sipping champagne beneath ancient oak trees. It was meant to be a happy afternoon, yet something inside her refused to settle. She walked down the staircase, her heels clicking against the polished wood, and found Charles waiting by the door, adjusting his cufflinks. He looked up at her and smiled, the same smile that had once made her feel like the most important person in the world. Now it felt like a mask. "You look lovely," he said, though his eyes didn't quite meet hers. "Thank you," she replied softly, forcing her voice to stay light. "Shall we go?" The carriage ride to the Ashbourne estate was quiet, filled only with the sound of wheels against gravel and the occasional comment about the weather. Eleanor stared out the window, watching the countryside roll by, green hills dotted with grazing sheep, hedgerows bursting with wildflowers. She wanted to ask Charles directly about the perfume, about the late nights, about the way he had become a stranger in his own home. But she held her tongue, afraid of what the answer might be. When they arrived, the estate took her breath away, just as it always did. Tall iron gates opened onto a long driveway lined with cherry trees in full bloom. Beyond them stood the manor house itself, a magnificent structure of gray stone with towering windows that caught the afternoon sun. But it was the gardens that truly stole the show. Rows of roses in every shade imaginable stretched across the lawns, their fragrance filling the air. A string quartet played near a marble fountain, and waiters moved gracefully between guests, carrying trays of champagne and delicate pastries. Eleanor took Charles's arm as they stepped out of the carriage, greeted immediately by familiar faces. Lord and Lady Pemberton waved from near the rose arbor. Margaret Foss, her closest friend since childhood, rushed over with a wide smile and pulled her into a warm embrace. "You look absolutely radiant," Margaret said, linking her arm through Eleanor's. "Come, let me introduce you to some new faces before Charles steals you away for the afternoon." Charles chuckled and excused himself, saying he needed to greet a colleague from his office. Eleanor watched him disappear into the crowd, his tall figure weaving between guests until she lost sight of him completely. Margaret noticed the flicker of concern crossing her friend's face. "Is everything all right, Eleanor?" she asked gently. Eleanor forced a smile. "Everything is fine. I'm just a little tired, that's all." Margaret didn't press further, though her eyes lingered a moment longer than necessary. The two women walked together through the gardens, admiring the flowers, greeting acquaintances, and pausing to listen to the quartet play a soft, elegant tune. For a while, Eleanor allowed herself to relax, letting the beauty of the afternoon distract her from the unease that had followed her all morning. Then she saw her. A woman stood near the fountain, dressed in a stunning gown of deep emerald silk that seemed to shimmer with every movement she made. Her dark hair was pinned elegantly, a few loose curls framing her face. She was laughing at something one of the gentlemen had said, her head tilted back, confident and radiant. Eleanor didn't recognize her immediately, but something about the woman's presence made the hair on her arm stand up. "Who is that?" Eleanor asked quietly, nodding toward the fountain. Margaret followed her gaze and hesitated for just a moment too long before answering. "That's Vivian Marlowe. She's new to the social circle, arrived from the city a few months ago, Quite popular already from what I hear. Alina studied the woman a moment longer, unable to shake the strange feeling settling in her chest. There was nothing wrong with a stranger laughing at a garden party, nothing unusual about a new face among old friends. Yet her instincts, sharpened by weeks of unspoken doubt, told her to pay attention. As if sensing her thoughts, Charles reappeared at that exact moment, walking toward them with a glass of champagne in hand. But his eyes, just for a fraction of a second, flicked toward the fountain, toward Vivian before quickly returning to Alina. It was brief. It was subtle, but Alina caught it and her stomach twisted painfully. "There you are," Charles said, handing her a glass. "I thought you might enjoy something to drink." "Thank you," Alina replied, taking the glass with a steady hand despite the storm building inside her. Margaret, ever perceptive, changed the subject smoothly, steering the conversation toward the upcoming charity auction planned for the following month. Alina listened, nodded, and smiled at the right moments, but her mind kept drifting back to that brief glance, that fraction of a second when her husband's eyes had betrayed him. The afternoon continued, filled with polite conversation and admiring glances at the beautifully arranged gardens. Servants moved efficiently between groups of guests, offering refreshments and small delicacies. Somewhere near the hedges, children laughed as they played a game of hide and seek, their joy a stark contrast to the tension quietly building within Alina. She excused herself for a moment, walking toward a quiet bench beneath a willow tree, needing space to breathe and gather her thoughts. From her vantage point, she could see the entire garden spread before her, guests mingling happily beneath the summer sun. And there, near the rose arbor, she spotted Charles again, this time speaking quietly with Vivian Marlowe. They stood close together, their conversation clearly more intimate than a simple introduction between strangers. Vivian's hand rested briefly on Charles's arm, and he didn't pull away. Alina's breath caught in her throat, her fingers gripping the edge of the bench tightly. She told herself there could be an innocent explanation. Perhaps they were discussing business, perhaps Vivian was connected to his office somehow. But the way Charles leaned in slightly, the way his expression softened in a manner she hadn't seen directed at her in months, told a different story entirely. A shadow fell over her, and she looked up to see a distinguished gentleman approaching, his posture confident yet unassuming. He wore a well-tailored suit, his dark hair neatly combed, his expression kind despite the formality of his bearing. Alina recognized him immediately as the host of the event. "Mrs. Whitfield, I presume," the Duke of Ashbourne said, offering a polite bow. "I hope you're enjoying the afternoon." Alina straightened quickly, composing herself before responding. "Your Grace, the gardens are absolutely beautiful. Thank you for having us." "The pleasure is mine," he replied warmly. "I do hope the roses meet your approval. My gardener has been rather anxious about this year's blooms." Alina managed a genuine smile, momentarily distracted from her earlier worry. "They're perfect, truly. You should tell him not to worry." The Duke studied her for a moment, his sharp eyes seeming to notice more than she intended to reveal. There was something calm and steady about his presence, a quiet strength that put her at ease despite the turmoil she carried inside. "If you'll excuse me," he said eventually, "I must greet my other guests, but please enjoy yourself this afternoon, Mrs. Whitfield." As he walked away, Alina watched him move gracefully through the crowd, greeting guests with genuine warmth, his presence commanding respect without any effort at all. She found herself wondering briefly what it might be like to feel truly seen by someone, rather than overlooked. Her attention returned to Charles and Vivian, still standing near the rose arbor, their heads bent close together in conversation. Margaret appeared beside her once more, following her gaze with growing concern. "Alina," she said softly, "perhaps we should walk toward the refreshment table, away from here." Alina nodded slowly, allowing her friend to guide her away, though her mind remained fixed on the image of her husband standing far too close to a woman she had never met before today. The afternoon sun continued to shine brightly over the beautiful gardens, the quartet still playing their gentle music, guests still laughing and mingling without a care in the world. But for Alina, the beauty of the day had begun to feel like a stage set for something far more painful, something she couldn't yet name but could feel approaching with every passing minute. She squared her shoulders, determined to maintain her composure, unaware that the true storm of the afternoon had not yet even begun. The refreshment table stood beneath a canopy of white silk, laden with delicate cakes, fresh strawberries, and crystal glasses filled with sparkling lemonade. Alina accepted a small plate from Margaret, though her appetite had vanished entirely. She forced herself to nibble at a slice of cake, if only to appear normal to the guests milling around her. "You've barely touched your food," Margaret observed, her voice gentle but knowing. "Alina, talk to me. What's really going on?" Alina set down her plate, glancing around to ensure no one else was listening. "I don't know, Margaret. Charles has been distant for weeks. Late nights at the office, strange excuses, and now this perfume on his coat that certainly isn't mine." Margaret's expression darkened slightly, though she chose her words carefully. "I've heard whispers, Alina. Nothing confirmed, mind you, just gossip among the ladies. Something about Charles being seen around town with a woman who isn't you." The words landed like a physical blow, though Alina had already suspected as much. Hearing it spoken aloud, however, made the fear feel undeniably real. "Do you know who?" she asked quietly, though she already feared the answer. Margaret hesitated, glancing briefly toward the rose arbor where Vivian Marlowe still stood, now surrounded by a small group of admiring gentlemen. "I can't say for certain, but the timing of her arrival in society does seem rather suspicious, doesn't it?" Alina followed her friend's gaze, watching Vivian laugh and charm the men around her with practiced ease. There was something calculated about her movements, something that suggested she knew exactly the effect she had on those watching her. Alina's stomach churned with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. "I need some air," Alina murmured, setting down her plate and walking briskly away from the refreshment table. She wandered deeper into the gardens, following a stone path bordered by lavender bushes, their fragrance calming her racing thoughts if only slightly. The sounds of the party faded behind her, replaced by the gentle hum of bees and the distant trickle of a hidden fountain. She needed a moment alone, away from prying eyes and painful whispers, to gather herself before returning to face whatever the rest of the afternoon might bring. As she rounded a bend in the path, she nearly collided with Charles, who had apparently wandered off from his conversation with Vivian. He looked startled to see her, his expression shifting quickly from surprise to forced calm. "Alina," he said, clearing his throat, "I didn't expect to find you here." "Clearly not," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "You seemed quite occupied near the roses." Charles's jaw tightened, though he attempted to brush off her comment with a casual laugh. "Just discussing a business matter with Miss Marlowe. She's connected to a client my firm is courting." Alina studied his face carefully, searching for any sign of the truth beneath his words. "Is that so? It looked rather personal for a business discussion." "Alina, please," Charles said, his tone shifting toward irritation. "Must you make something out of nothing? It was a simple conversation." She wanted to press further, to demand the truth once and for all, but the fear of confirming her worst suspicions held her back. Instead, she took a steadying breath and nodded, though her heart continued to pound with unresolved doubt. "Of course," she said quietly, "forgive me for asking." Charles softened slightly, perhaps sensing he had pushed too hard. He reached for her hand, his fingers warm against hers, though the gesture felt hollow compared to the affection they once shared. "Let's enjoy the rest of the afternoon, shall we? Together." Alina allowed him to lead her back toward the main gathering, though the unease in her chest refused to fade. They rejoined the crowd near the fountain, where guests had begun to form small circles, engaging in animated conversation about politics, fashion, and the upcoming social season. Alina smiled and nodded where appropriate, though her attention remained divided, constantly aware of Vivian's presence somewhere nearby. The Duke of Ashbourne moved gracefully among his guests, ensuring everyone felt welcomed and attended to. Alina watched him interact with an elderly couple near the hedges, his patience and genuine interest evident in every gesture. There was something reassuring about his calm demeanor, a stark contrast to the tension simmering within her own marriage. As the afternoon progressed, the string quartet shifted to a livelier tune, encouraging several couples to begin dancing on the lawn. Charles, ever mindful of appearances, extended his hand to Alina, inviting her to join the dance. She accepted, if only to maintain the illusion of a happy marriage in front of their peers. They moved together across the grass, Charles's steps practiced and confident, though his eyes seemed to wander occasionally toward the crowd surrounding Vivian. Alina noticed each glance, each subtle shift in his attention, and her heart grew heavier with every passing moment. When the dance ended, Charles excused himself once more, claiming he needed to speak with a business associate near the terrace. Alina watched him walk away, her suspicions deepening as she noticed his path leading directly toward the area where Vivian now stood alone, having separated herself from her group of admirers. Margaret appeared beside her once again, her expression sympathetic. "Alina, perhaps we should focus on enjoying the party ourselves. There's no use dwelling on speculation." "You're right," Alina said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Let's find somewhere to sit and enjoy the music." They settled onto a bench near the edge of the garden, close enough to observe the party but far enough to escape the immediate crowd. Alina tried to focus on the conversation Margaret initiated about an upcoming trip to the countryside, but her attention kept drifting back toward Charles and Vivian, now standing close together near a stone archway covered in climbing ivy. She couldn't hear their conversation from this distance, but the body language spoke volumes. Vivian's hand rested lightly on Charles's forearm, her head tilted close to his, as she whispered something that made him smile in a way Alina hadn't seen directed at her in months. The intimacy of the moment felt like a knife twisting in her chest. "Alina," Margaret said softly, noticing her friend's distraction. "Perhaps it's time we spoke with Charles directly together and settled this uncertainty once and for all." Before Alina could respond, a ripple of whispers began spreading through the nearby guests, drawing attention toward the archway where Charles and Vivian stood. Several onlookers exchanged knowing glances, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and quiet judgment. Alina's cheeks flushed with embarrassment as she realized their private moment had not gone unnoticed by others. The Duke of Ashbourne, standing nearby with a small group of guests, also seemed to notice the growing attention directed toward the archway. His expression remained composed, though a subtle furrow appeared between his brows, suggesting he too had registered the inappropriate closeness between Charles and the woman beside him. Alina rose from the bench, her pride demanding she address the situation directly rather than allow the whispers to continue unchecked. Margaret reached for her arm, concern evident in her eyes. "Alina, wait, perhaps this isn't the right moment." "There will never be a right moment, Margaret," Alina replied firmly, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. "I need to speak with my husband." She walked purposefully across the lawn, her heart pounding with each step, acutely aware of the curious eyes following her progress. As she approached the archway, Charles noticed her arrival first, quickly stepping back from Vivian with an expression of guilt flashing across his features before he masked it with false composure. "Alina," he said, his voice slightly strained, "I was just finishing my conversation with Miss Marlowe." Vivian turned to face Alina fully, her expression carrying an air of confidence that bordered on defiance. She studied Alina from head to toe, a slight smile playing at the corners of her lips, as though she found the entire situation rather amusing. "Mrs. Whitfield," Vivian said smoothly, extending a gloved hand. "A pleasure to finally meet you. Charles speaks of you often." Alina accepted the handshake stiffly, her jaw tight with restrained emotion. "Does he? I can't say the same, as I've only just learned your name today." The comment hung in the air, sharp enough to make Vivian's smile falter slightly, though she quickly recovered her composure. "Well, we can't all move in the same circles, can we?" The condescension in her tone was unmistakable, and Alina felt her patience thinning rapidly. Charles, sensing the rising tension, attempted to intervene. "Perhaps we should rejoin the party, Alina. The Duke will be serving refreshments shortly." "In a moment, Charles," Alina said, her eyes never leaving Vivian's face. "I'd like to understand exactly how you and my husband came to know each other so well." Vivian's expression shifted, the earlier amusement replaced by something colder, more calculating. "Perhaps you should ask him that question directly, Mrs. Whitfield. I'm merely an acquaintance." The word acquaintance carried a weight that suggested otherwise, and Alina's suspicions solidified into something resembling certainty. She turned to Charles, searching his face for any sign of honesty, only to find him avoiding her gaze entirely, his attention fixed on the ground beneath his polished shoes. Nearby guests had begun to gather more openly now, drawn by the evident tension between the three individuals standing beneath the ivy-covered archway. Margaret approached cautiously, positioning herself beside Alina in silent support, while whispers continued to ripple through the crowd like wind through tall grass. The Duke of Ashbourne, observing the scene from a short distance away, began making his way toward the archway, his expression unreadable but his pace deliberate. Something told Alina that the calm surface of the afternoon was about to shatter completely, and she braced herself for whatever confrontation awaited in the moments to come. "Charles," Alina said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her chest, "look at me and tell me the truth. Is there something between you and Miss Marlowe?" The crowd around them had grown considerably, guests pausing their own conversations to watch the unfolding drama beneath the archway. Charles's face had gone pale, his usual confidence replaced by visible discomfort as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Alina, this isn't the place," he said quietly, though his voice lacked the conviction needed to end the conversation. "Then where is the place, Charles?" Alina pressed, her frustration finally breaking through the composed exterior she had maintained all afternoon. "You've been distant for weeks. There's perfume on your coat that isn't mine. And now I find you whispering intimately with a woman I've never met, at a party meant to be enjoyable for everyone." Vivian, rather than remaining silent as propriety might have suggested, stepped forward with a look of irritation crossing her sharp features. "Perhaps if you paid more attention to your husband at home, Mrs. Whitfield, he wouldn't need to seek company elsewhere." The comment sent a ripple of gasps through the surrounding guests, several hands rising to cover open mouths in shock at the boldness of the statement. Alina felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, though she refused to let it show in her expression. "How dare you speak to me that way?" Alina replied, her voice trembling slightly but remaining firm. "You know nothing about my marriage or the effort I've put into it." Vivian laughed, a sharp, cold sound that carried no genuine humor. "I know enough, Mrs. Whitfield. I know that Charles finds comfort with me because he no longer finds it with you. Perhaps it's time you accepted that reality rather than making a scene in front of all these lovely people." Margaret stepped forward, unable to contain her own outrage at the audacity of Vivian's words. "That's quite enough. You have no right to speak to Alina this way, especially not in public." "I'll speak however I please," Vivian snapped back, her composure cracking under the weight of the growing audience and her own frustration at being confronted so directly. "Charles has told me himself that his marriage has been nothing but a formality for years. Perhaps you should ask him yourself, Mrs. Whitfield, instead of relying on rumors and gossip. Charles's face had turned an alarming shade of red, caught between the two women and utterly unable to form a coherent response. "Vivian, please, that's enough," he finally managed, though his voice carried little authority. "Is it not true, Charles?" Vivian challenged, turning her sharp gaze toward him. Tell her what you told me last week about wanting a different life, away from this tired marriage." The words hit Alina like a physical force, stealing the breath from her lungs. She stared at Charles, waiting desperately for him to deny the claim, to defend their marriage and dismiss Vivian's cruel words as nothing more than manipulation. But Charles remained silent, his eyes fixed on the ground, unable to meet Alina's searching gaze. His silence spoke louder than any words could have, confirming every fear Alina had carried since noticing the strange perfume that morning. Tears threatened to spill from her eyes, though she fought desperately to maintain her composure in front of the gathering crowd. "Charles," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly, "please say something." But he remained silent, his shoulders slumped in defeat, offering no defense against Vivian's accusations or comfort to his humiliated wife. The silence stretched uncomfortably, broken only by the distant sound of the string quartet still playing somewhere near the main lawn, oblivious to the personal disaster unfolding beneath the archway. Vivian, emboldened by Charles's continued silence, pressed her advantage further. "You see, Mrs. Whitfield, even now he cannot bring himself to defend a marriage that means nothing to him anymore. Perhaps it's time you gracefully stepped aside and allowed him the happiness he deserves." The audacity of the statement, combined with weeks of suppressed hurt and suspicion, finally broke through Alina's careful composure. "You have no right," she said, her voice rising with barely contained emotion, "to stand here and dictate the terms of my marriage. Whatever exists between you and Charles is a betrayal, plain and simple, regardless of how you choose to justify it." "A betrayal," Vivian repeated, her tone dripping with condescension. "Perhaps you should look inward, Mrs. Whitfield, before casting blame outward. A man doesn't stray from a marriage that fulfills him." The crowd had grown noticeably larger now, drawn by the escalating confrontation, their whispered commentary creating a constant murmur beneath the afternoon sun. Alina felt exposed, humiliated beyond anything she had ever experienced, standing before dozens of familiar faces while her marriage crumbled in real time. "I've given everything to this marriage," Alina said, her voice trembling with barely restrained anger. "Years of my life, my loyalty, my trust. And you stand here, a stranger to most of these people, claiming to understand something you know nothing about." Vivian's expression hardened further, any pretense of civility abandoned entirely. "I understand enough to know that Charles deserves better than a wife who bores him. Perhaps that's difficult for you to accept, but it's the truth." Something inside Alina snapped at the cruelty of the statement, years of insecurity and recent betrayal converging into a moment of raw emotion she could no longer suppress. "You know nothing about what Charles deserves. You've simply taken advantage of a moment of weakness, and now you stand here parading your affair as though it's something to be proud of." Vivian's eyes flashed with fury at the accusation, her carefully maintained composure finally shattering completely. "How dare you speak to me as though I'm the villain in this situation? Charles came to me, Mrs. Whitfield. He sought comfort because you failed to provide it." "Enough," Charles finally interjected, though his voice remained weak and ineffective against the storm he had created. "Both of you, please, this isn't the place for this conversation." But it was too late for restraint. Vivian, humiliated by the growing audience witnessing her exposed affair, and infuriated by Alina's refusal to simply accept defeat quietly, took a step closer, her expression twisted with anger. "You think you can stand here and humiliate me in front of these people?" Vivian hissed, her voice low but carrying clearly to those nearby. You have no idea what you're dealing with." "I'm not trying to humiliate anyone," Alina replied, standing her ground despite the fear building in her chest. "I'm simply demanding honesty from my husband and basic respect from someone who has clearly disregarded any sense of decency." The word decency seemed to ignite something within Vivian, her carefully constructed facade of confidence crumbling entirely under the weight of public exposure and wounded pride. Before Alina could react, before anyone in the stunned crowd could intervene, Vivian's hand moved swiftly through the air, connecting sharply with Alina's cheek. The sound echoed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence that followed, gasps rippling through the crowd like a wave crashing against rocks. Alina's head turned sharply from the force of the strike, her hand instinctively rising to cover her burning cheek, as shock rendered her momentarily speechless. Charles stood frozen, his mouth opening slightly as though to protest, yet no sound emerged. His paralysis in the face of his wife's public humiliation spoke volumes about the state of their marriage, confirming every doubt Alina had harbored throughout the tense afternoon. The entire garden seemed to hold its breath, guests staring in stunned silence at the scene unfolding beneath the ivy-covered archway. Margaret rushed to Alina's side immediately, her arm wrapping protectively around her friend's shoulders, though her wide eyes reflected the same shock permeating the crowd. Alina stood motionless for a long moment, her cheeks stinging, her mind struggling to process the sudden violence that had erupted from what began as painful but civil conversation. Tears welled in her eyes, though she refused to let them fall in front of the crowd now watching her with a mixture of sympathy and morbid curiosity. Vivian, seemingly realizing the magnitude of what she had just done in front of dozens of witnesses, took a step backward, her expression shifting from fury to something resembling panic. But before she could speak, before anyone in the crowd could move to address the shocking turn of events, a commanding voice cut through the stunned silence. The Duke of Ashbourne moved through the crowd with a purposeful stride, his usual calm demeanor replaced by something far more authoritative, his eyes fixed sharply on the scene beneath the archway. Guests parted instinctively to allow him passage, their whispers falling silent as they recognized the seriousness in his expression. "That is quite enough," the Duke said, his voice carrying an authority that immediately commanded attention from everyone present. He positioned himself directly between Alina and Vivian, his tall frame creating a physical barrier that left no room for further confrontation. Vivian's face had drained of color, her earlier confidence completely evaporated under the weight of the Duke's stern gaze. "Your Grace, This was simply a misunderstanding, nothing more." "A misunderstanding," the Duke repeated, his tone icy despite its measured calm. "I witnessed what occurred here, Miss Marlowe, as did every guest standing within view of this archway. There is no misunderstanding about striking another person, particularly a guest under my roof." The crowd murmured in agreement, several guests nodding as they recalled the shocking moment they had just witnessed. Alina remained still, Margaret's arm still wrapped supportively around her shoulders, her cheek still burning from the impact of Vivian's hand. "Your Grace, please," Vivian tried again, her voice taking on a pleading quality entirely absent from her earlier confidence. "It was a moment of heightened emotion, surely you understand." "What I understand," the Duke interrupted firmly, "is that you have behaved in a manner unbecoming of any guest invited into my home. Regardless of whatever personal matters exist between yourself, Mrs. Whitfield, and Mr. Whitfield, there is absolutely no justification for resorting to such behavior in a public setting, or indeed, in any setting at all." Charles, finally finding his voice amid the chaos, stepped forward hesitantly. "Your Grace, if I may explain the circumstances." "You may explain nothing to me, Mr. Whitfield," the Duke said, turning his sharp gaze toward Charles with equal severity. "Your conduct this afternoon has been equally troubling. A married man entertaining the affections of another woman at a social gathering, while his own wife stands mere feet away, reflects poorly on your character, regardless of whatever private difficulties may exist within your marriage. Charles's face flushed deeply, shame evident in his downcast eyes as the weight of the Duke's words settled over the silent crowd. Several guests exchanged knowing glances, the earlier whispers now solidifying into confirmed understanding of the situation that had played out before them. The Duke turned his attention back to Vivian, his expression softening only slightly, though his tone remained firm and unyielding. "Miss Marlowe, I must ask you to leave my estate immediately. Your presence here is no longer welcome, and I trust you understand the seriousness of what has transpired." Vivian's composure crumbled entirely under the public reprimand, her eyes darting nervously toward the surrounding guests, many of whom she had spent the afternoon charming and impressing. Now, those same faces regarded her with expressions ranging from disapproval to outright disdain. "Your Grace, surely there's no need for such drastic measures," she attempted weakly, though the pleading tone in her voice made clear she understood the futility of further argument. "There is every need," the Duke replied firmly. "I will have someone escort you to your carriage. I suggest you gather your composure before departing, as further outbursts will not be tolerated." With visible reluctance and evident humiliation, Vivian nodded stiffly, her earlier confidence entirely replaced by the sting of public disgrace. She cast one final glance toward Charles, perhaps hoping for some show of support or defense, but he remained silent, his eyes fixed firmly on the ground beneath his feet. As a member of the estate staff approached to escort Vivian away, the Duke turned his full attention toward Eleanor, his expression shifting into something considerably gentler than the stern authority he had displayed moments before. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said softly, "are you injured?" Eleanor shook her head slightly, though her hand still rested against her cheek, the skin tender beneath her fingers. "I'm quite all right, Your Grace. Simply startled, that's all." The Duke reached into his coat pocket and produced a neatly folded handkerchief, offering it to her with a gesture of genuine concern. "Please, allow me to offer you a moment of privacy, away from the remaining guests, should you wish to gather yourself." Eleanor accepted the handkerchief gratefully, her fingers trembling slightly as she pressed it lightly against her cheek. "Thank you, Your Grace. Your kindness means more than you realize." "Nonsense need not be tolerated in my home, Mrs. Whitfield," the Duke replied firmly, though his eyes carried genuine warmth as he addressed her. "No guest of mine should ever be subjected to such treatment, regardless of the circumstances leading to it." Margaret, still standing protectively beside her friend, offered the Duke a grateful smile. "Thank you, Your Grace, for intervening. Eleanor didn't deserve any of this." "No one deserves such treatment," the Duke agreed, his gaze shifting briefly toward Charles, who still stood awkwardly nearby, unable to meet anyone's eyes directly. "I would suggest, Mr. Whitfield, that you take this opportunity to reflect seriously on your conduct, both today and in recent weeks. Whatever difficulties exist within your marriage deserve honest resolution, not public spectacle and further humiliation of your wife." Charles nodded weakly, shame etched deeply into his features as the surrounding guests continued to observe the aftermath of the confrontation with quiet judgment. Several murmured comments reached Eleanor's ears, though she found herself unable to focus on their exact words, her mind still reeling from the sudden violence and public exposure of her private pain. The Duke gestured toward a quieter section of the garden, away from the curious eyes still lingering nearby. "Mrs. Whitfield, please, allow me to escort you somewhere more private. You've endured quite enough for one afternoon." Eleanor accepted his offer gratefully, allowing him to guide her away from the archway and toward a secluded bench nestled beneath a canopy of wisteria vines. Margaret followed closely behind, her expression still reflecting concern for her friend's well-being. As they settled onto the bench, away from the remaining commotion near the main gathering, The Duke remained standing nearby, his posture respectful yet attentive. "Mrs. Whitfield, I want you to know that what occurred here today reflects entirely on the poor judgment of others, not on any failing of your own." Alina looked up at him, genuine gratitude evident in her tear-filled eyes. "Thank you, Your Grace. I confess I didn't expect such kindness, especially not from someone I've only just met." "Kindness should never be a rare commodity, Mrs. Whitfield," the Duke replied softly, "particularly not towards someone who has clearly endured a great deal of pain today, both public and private." Margaret sat beside Alina, gently patting her friend's hand in silent support. "Perhaps we should return home, Alina. You've had more than enough excitement for one afternoon." Alina nodded slowly, though her gaze drifted briefly toward Charles, who remained standing awkwardly near the archway, still unable to approach her directly amid the weight of his own shame and the judgment of the watching crowd. She wondered in that moment how their marriage had deteriorated so completely, and what path lay ahead now that the truth had been exposed so publicly and so painfully. The Duke, noticing her lingering gaze toward her husband, spoke quietly. "Whatever decisions you make moving forward, Mrs. Whitfield, please know that you deserve respect and honesty, nothing less. Should you need anything at all, my household remains at your service." Alina offered him a small, genuine smile, the first real moment of comfort she had experienced throughout the entire painful afternoon. "Thank you, Your Grace. Your words mean a great deal to me right now." As the afternoon sun continued its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the beautiful gardens now tainted by the day's dramatic events, Alina found herself grappling with a mixture of emotions, heartbreak intertwined with an unexpected sense of clarity. Whatever remained of her marriage to Charles now hung precariously in the balance, exposed publicly and undeniably fractured beyond simple repair. News of the incident spread through the social circles of the county with remarkable speed, carried from household to household by servants, guests, and eager gossips who had witnessed the dramatic confrontation firsthand. By the following morning, Alina could scarcely step outside without noticing the whispered conversations and curious glances directed her way. She sat in the quiet parlor of her home, staring out the window at the garden she had once tended with such pride, now feeling strangely disconnected from the life she had built there. Margaret arrived shortly after breakfast, her expression a mixture of concern and quiet determination. "How are you feeling this morning?" Margaret asked, settling into the chair across from Alina. "Numb mostly," Alina admitted, her fingers wrapped tightly around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. "I keep replaying yesterday in my mind, trying to understand how everything fell apart so quickly." "It wasn't quick, Alina," Margaret said gently. "It had been building for weeks, perhaps longer. Yesterday simply brought everything into the light." Alina nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth in her friend's words. "Charles hasn't spoken a word since we returned home last night. He's been avoiding me entirely, hiding in his study." "What will you do?" Margaret asked carefully, though genuine concern colored her tone rather than judgment. Alina took a deep breath, considering the question seriously for the first time since the previous afternoon's chaos. "I don't know yet. Part of me wants to fight for what we once had, but another part recognizes that perhaps what we had wasn't as strong as I believed." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a carriage approaching the house, wheels crunching against the gravel drive. Alina glanced out the window, surprised to see the distinctive crest of the Ashbourne estate emblazoned on the carriage door. Moments later, a servant announced the arrival of the Duke himself, requesting a brief audience with Alina. She smoothed her dress nervously, uncertain what had prompted such an unexpected visit, before instructing the servant to show him into the parlor. The Duke entered with his usual composed demeanor, though his expression carried genuine warmth as he greeted Alina and Margaret. "Mrs. Whitfield, Miss Foss, forgive my unannounced visit. I wanted to ensure you were recovering well after yesterday's unfortunate events." Alina rose to greet him, gesturing toward an available seat. "Your Grace, this is very kind of you. Please sit down. Would you care for some tea?" "Thank you, but I won't stay long," the Duke replied, settling into the offered chair with practiced grace. "I simply wanted to check on your well-being personally, rather than relying on second-hand reports." "That's very thoughtful of you," Alina said, genuinely touched by his continued kindness. "I'm managing, though the events of yesterday have left me with a great deal to consider." The Duke nodded understandingly. "I imagined so. I also wanted to inform you that Miss Marlowe's family has been notified of the incident, and I've made it clear she is no longer welcome at any future gatherings hosted by my estate." Margaret spoke up, curiosity evident in her tone. "And what of Charles, your Grace? Has there been any word regarding consequences for his role in yesterday's events?" The Duke's expression grew more serious. "Mr. Whitfield's conduct is, of course, a matter for his own conscience and for Mrs. Whitfield to address as she sees fit. However, I understand from mutual acquaintances that his standing among our social circle has suffered considerably following yesterday's revelations." Alina absorbed this information quietly, uncertain how she felt about the news. Part of her recognized a small sense of satisfaction that Charles's betrayal hadn't gone entirely without consequence, while another part mourned the public destruction of a marriage she had once cherished deeply. "Your Grace," Alina said after a moment of contemplative silence, "I must ask, why have you taken such a personal interest in ensuring my well-being? We barely knew each other before yesterday's events." The Duke considered his response carefully before answering. "Mrs. Whitfield, I witnessed genuine dignity in how you conducted yourself yesterday, despite the humiliation and pain you experienced. That resilience left a considerable impression on me. I simply wished to ensure that someone deserving of respect received it, at least from my household." Alina felt warmth spreading through her chest at his sincere words, a stark contrast to the coldness she had experienced from Charles in recent weeks. "Thank you, Your Grace. Your kindness has meant more to me than you likely realize." Their conversation continued for a while longer, touching on lighter topics as the Duke seemed genuinely interested in Alina's thoughts and opinions, treating her with a respect and attentiveness she had nearly forgotten she deserved. When he eventually rose to depart, promising to check in again soon, Alina found herself experiencing a small flicker of hope amid the wreckage of her personal life. Over the following days, Alina made the difficult decision to confront Charles directly regarding the future of their marriage. She found him one evening in his study, staring blankly at a stack of unread correspondence, his usual confidence entirely absent. "Charles," she said, closing the door behind her, "we need to discuss what happens next." He looked up, guilt evident in his tired eyes. "Alina, I know I've hurt you terribly. I don't know how to begin making amends for what happened." "Do you love her?" Alina asked directly, needing to understand the full truth before making any decisions about their future. Charles hesitated, clearly struggling with how to answer honestly. "I don't know what I feel anymore, Alina. I've been unhappy for a long time, and Vivian offered something that felt exciting and new, but I never intended for things to become so public, so damaging." "Your intentions matter little now, Charles," Alina replied, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the conversation. "The damage has been done, publicly and painfully. I need to know whether you believe our marriage can be salvaged, or whether it's time we both accepted that it's beyond repair." Charles remained silent for a long moment, the weight of the question settling heavily between them. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can give you what you deserve anymore, Alina. Perhaps it would be best if we considered a separation." The words, though painful, brought Alina an unexpected sense of relief, as though a burden she had carried for weeks had finally been acknowledged openly. "Perhaps you're right," she said quietly. "I think that would be for the best." Their conversation concluded with a mutual, if painful, understanding that their marriage had reached its inevitable end. In the weeks that followed, Alina focused on rebuilding her life, drawing strength from the unwavering support of Margaret and the unexpected kindness of the Duke of Ashbourne, who continued to check on her well-being regularly. As autumn arrived, bringing with it cooler winds and changing leaves, Alina found herself walking through the gardens of the Ashbourne estate once more, this time at the Duke's personal invitation for a quiet afternoon tea. The roses had faded with the changing season, but new blooms of chrysanthemums had taken their place, vibrant and resilient despite the shifting weather. "You seem more at peace than when we first met," the Duke observed, walking beside her along the familiar garden path. "I feel more at peace," Alina admitted, genuine contentment coloring her voice for the first time in months. "Losing Charles was painful, but I've come to realize that some endings create space for new beginnings." The Duke smiled warmly, his expression carrying a gentle affection that had grown steadily since their initial meeting months earlier. "I'm glad to hear that, Mrs. Whitfield. You deserve happiness, genuine and unshadowed by past betrayals." Alina glanced at him, appreciating the quiet strength and consistent kindness he had shown her throughout the difficult months following the incident at his garden party. "Your Grace, I must confess, your support has meant more to me than mere friendship might explain." The Duke paused, turning to face her fully, his expression earnest and open. "Mrs. Whitfield, Alina, if I may, I've come to care for you deeply since that unfortunate afternoon, far beyond simple concern for a guest wronged in my own home. I hope, in time, you might allow yourself to consider a future that includes genuine happiness, perhaps alongside someone who values you completely." Alina felt her heart flutter with a mixture of surprise and hope, emotions she hadn't expected to feel again so soon after the collapse of her marriage. "Your Grace, Edmund, I believe I would like that very much." As they continued their walk through the vibrant autumn gardens, the pain of the past began to feel more distant, replaced gradually by the promise of a future built on honesty, respect, and genuine affection. Alina had emerged from the wreckage of her marriage stronger and wiser, discovering along the way that sometimes the most painful moments lead unexpectedly toward the greatest personal growth and unforeseen happiness. The story of her humiliation at the garden party would linger in social memory for some time, whispered occasionally among those who witnessed it firsthand. But for Alina, it had become something else entirely, not a moment of shame, but the beginning of a journey toward reclaiming her dignity and discovering a love built on mutual respect rather than deception. As winter approached and the gardens prepared for their seasonal rest, Alina walked forward into her new life with quiet confidence, forever grateful for the unexpected kindness of a duke who had chosen to stand beside her when she needed it most.